The two world wars took place in the previous century, the 20th century. Despite this, humanity managed to overcome the challenges and continue progressing, albeit at a slow pace. In my opinion, the 14th century holds the title for the worst century in human history. During this time, the Inquisition had already lost much of its power but still existed. To ensure one's safety, it was advisable to attend church, not declare oneself as an atheist, and avoid contradicting religious texts as a scientist. Furthermore, at the beginning of the 14th century, Europe experienced a severe food crisis known as the Great Famine. As the name suggests, it was a period of widespread food shortage, causing famine throughout the continent. The majority of crops faced problems, leading to starvation and the death of tens of thousands of people. However, those who survived the famine would face an even worse challenge in the 14th century, the Black Death. The Black Death, a highly contagious and deadly disease, was a pandemic that plagued Europe. It caused slow and agonizing deaths, turning the entire continent into a living hell. In this video, we will explore the origins, causes, measures taken, death toll, and other interesting facts about the Black Death, which lasted for 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Interesting Day. And as we always do, let's start from the beginning. The Black Death was a disease that already existed in the East, specifically in China and India. But what does this disease do? Well, its most distinctive feature is the appearance of buboes. These are like swollen tumors that appear on the person's body and can inflate, reaching the size of a chicken egg or an orange when the disease is in an advanced state. These buboes then turn into open wounds on the person's body, infecting others with the bacteria just by coming into contact with these wounds. Another peculiarity are the black spots that appear on the body, hence the name Black Death. These spots appear due to internal hemorrhages that occur in various organs. So, in simpler terms, this disease causes your organs to become congested and filled from within. And if that wasn't enough, there are also a series of minor symptoms: high fever, headache, intense cold, weakness, nausea, vomiting, and more. In other words, the disease is a true curse. Now, let's understand how this curse, the Black Death, spread throughout Europe. It all began in 1343 when European merchants, using ships, imported and exported products to the East, China, and India, where the disease already existed. If you've studied history or had contact with any ships, or even watched movies about pirates and the Navy, you may know something. The hold of each of these ships is filled with rats, and rats are infested with fleas. These fleas from rats are the agents that started spreading the disease. At this point, we should remember the precarious living conditions during the Middle Ages. There was no sewage system, no running water, and no garbage collection service, especially for the poor in the big cities. People would not only throw their own waste out the window, but also their own feces. Believe it or not, that's how things worked. That's why many families had animals at home to devour the waste and feces, sometimes even doing so in the streets. I don't even think I need to explain that such a scenario was perfect for the proliferation of rats. And with rats everywhere, the fleas carrying the bacteria of the Black Death also spread. And so, the pandemic begins. Infected people, after showing the first symptoms, would die within 3 to 5 days, suffering greatly. And let me tell you, the number of deaths was not small. There is no exact way to give an accurate number of deaths because, during that time, they didn't have all the statistics we have today. What can be said for certain is that 1 in every 3 people died in the entire Europe, and in some cities, half of the population died. The peak of this whole thing lasted a little over 3 years, between 1347 and 1350, when the highest number of deaths occurred. The estimate is that between 30 and 50 million people died in just this 3-year period. To give you an idea, people gave up burying the dead, who were scattered everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. In the streets, on the roads, inside any house, in the fields, and in the squares. Corpses were everywhere, and people had to live in this morbid scenario. Some artworks and paintings from that time depict this situation vividly. As you can see, it's worth noting that the pandemic also reached some parts of Russia and China, killing millions of people there as well. But the most well-known story is that of Europe, as the entire continent was contaminated. But now, let's talk about one of the most intriguing aspects of this topic, the bacteria that lived in the fleas of rats. It infected humans, and infected humans further spread the disease through wounds or coughing up blood. However, if there was no sewage system at that time, do you think people knew about the existence of microorganisms? Of course not. There was no technology, and medicine was still far from reaching that point. Therefore, people's explanations, including those from scientists, government officials, and the church, varied greatly. Some explanations were worse than others. Some scientists claimed they couldn't explain it, but they associated the emergence of the plague with the alignment of certain planets. On the other hand, the church believed it was a punishment from God, and the best remedy was prayer. The more sensible people, even though they were wrong, blamed it on miasma. Miasma is the public odor, the air contaminated by decomposing substances. Remember when I mentioned that people lived in terrible conditions, throwing trash and feces in the streets? Well, with the onset of the Black Death, corpses were left to decompose anywhere. Of course, the already horrible smell became even worse, and some people believed that this miasma was a cause of the plague, spreading through the air in this way. This is how the famous plague doctors or plague physicians emerged. These individuals dressed entirely in black, wearing a hat or hood covering their heads, and masks that resembled a bird's beak, covering their faces. Some of them also carried a suitcase and so on. They indeed had a mysterious appearance, and I quite liked their visual. However, the truth is that they were useless, as I mentioned before. They believed that the disease spread through the air, but it's not quite like that. Inside the mask, they placed various aromatic herbs and even perfumes to get rid of the smell of miasma. Many of them ended up coming into contact with infected individuals in some way and died as well. Not to mention, there was simply nothing, absolutely nothing, that could be done for an infected person at that time. They didn't have a cure, which is why they were useless. Another peculiar group that emerged during this time was the Brotherhood of Flagellants. You may have already seen those people who beat their own backs with leather straps to atone for sins and such. This is a form of self-punishment, and that's exactly what the Brotherhood of Flagellants did. Believing in the words of the church, these people thought that God was punishing the world for its sins. They traveled through the roads, visiting villages and cities, walking the streets while injuring themselves by beating their own backs with these whips. I believe I don't even need to mention that this act of inflicting wounds on their own bodies only made it easier for them to become contaminated and consequently spread the disease to other cities. Another interesting fact is that even during this period of so much misery, some small wars between empires and similar things continued to happen, albeit with a significantly reduced number of participants. The bodies of people who died from the Black Plague were used as weapons, making it one of the earliest instances of biological warfare in human history. Armies would place bodies in catapults and launch them into cities that had not yet been infected, allowing the disease to spread from person to person, causing further chaos. One thing that proved to be very effective in combating the Black Plague was quarantine. Some cities with walls simply closed their gates, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. This successfully prevented the bacteria from reaching people or rats within the city. However, even those who did the right thing did it the wrong way. They locked the gates, believing that this would prevent infected people from entering, which resulted in a significant amount of prejudice even after the plague subsided. Speaking of which, the plague never truly ended, it receded. From 1343 to 1353, which is a total of 10 years, the Black Plague claimed the lives of between 75 and 200 million people in Europe alone. It was undoubtedly one of the greatest disasters in human history and the largest pandemic the world had ever seen. After these 10 years, the disease regressed, but the people of the 14th century, who had already experienced the Inquisition, the Great Famine, and the Black Plague, still had another challenge ahead, the 100 Years' War. But that's a topic for another video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on Interesting Day. See you next time.